You're listening to Module 5 of Poly 437 International Security. In this module, we are going to focus on cooperation and what are the factors that compel states to begin to cooperate with each other in pursuit of securing themselves against outside threats. Of course, cooperation is a dicey prospect in a world ruled by anarchy. If Hobbes's notion of the state of nature is an accurate way of describing international politics today, then we know that cooperating with other states runs the risk of being betrayed by those partners in security. That you are better off trusting yourself and relying on your own wit and power and capability than entering into some kind of cooperative relationship with a partner that may ultimately stab you in the back. And yet, when we look at the international environment, we do see a great deal of cooperation going on. Many state foreign policies are almost exclusively focused on facilitating cooperation between other states in pursuit of security. So this becomes an important question we have to explore. Why do states choose to work together despite the risks that are involved? Why do states decide that simply navigating an anarchical universe as a single solitary actor, why is that suddenly unacceptable? And the majority of states deciding to pursue some kind of cooperative arrangement with other states and believing this being a more prudent path to security. Indeed, it's not even in the contemporary world where we see cooperation taking place with regard to security. We can go back several hundred years and see examples of states cooperating with each other. As we look at the different types of cooperation that exist, we'll notice three different types of cooperation taking place. One takes the form of the Great Power Concert, and this will be more prominent further back in history. Concerts are not something we see a lot of in the contemporary world. We have Wilsonian collective security, which we do see examples of in the contemporary world. There is one example in particular that we'll talk about here in a moment. And then there's multilateralism and institutionalism. This is a rather large component of cooperation and security, and as a result, we'll give it a separate treatment in Module 6. The focus here will be the first two types listed here, Great Power Concert and collective security. So let's begin by identifying what we mean by a Great Power Concert. The temptation is, of course, to think of something musical. When we think of a concert, you think of some kind of musical event, but it turns out the word can be used in a different context, denoting cooperation primarily between great powers on an ad hoc basis. When we talk about concerts, we almost always talk about a relationship that takes place, that takes form between great powers within a particular region or around the world. We don't see a lot of concerts that feature smaller powers or lesser powers. Great power concerts tend to be informal. They are not the result of a formal treaty or a formal institution. They often are the result of meetings and summits and other types of arrangements that are made between heads of state and their diplomatic and foreign policy elites. They often, over a certain amount of time, can become more formal. They can be the foundation upon which a formal regime or a collective security arrangement or an institution can form. But oftentimes they are, again, ad hoc, temporary, and in some cases don't last very long because the agreements made were not sustainable among the actors who came to the agreement. Again, we can begin by asking the question, why would a state worried about being betrayed, worried about being attacked, paranoid about the intentions of other states, agree to enter into a concert relationship with another state? And the answer is that on certain security issues, the interests of the great powers may in fact coincide. After the end of a conflict, after the end of a war, oftentimes the belligerents who have cooperated in defeating an adversary, who have formed an alliance and have defeated an adversary, will want to cooperate in the post-war order. They will want to see a certain balance of power arrangement reconstructed after the end of a conflict, and they will all see that as being in their interest. So then they will cooperate with each other in a concert-like format often in order to restore this balance of power. Essentially, there are certain topics, certain areas where the interests of great powers can be realized more effectively and more efficiently when states cooperate with each other. This doesn't mean that they cooperate on every issue. This doesn't mean they coordinate on every issue. A good realist would say that while concerts do exist in history, they are not all that common. They are quite rare. And so one shouldn't see the creation of a concert as proof that the assumptions of realism are no longer in play. Again, sometimes powerful states see reasons to cooperate with each other. And when they do, and when they make these informal arrangements amongst themselves, then a concert is formed and the states are cooperating in pursuit of their national interests. So what does it take to create a successful concert? There's a few elements involved here. First off, all members must agree on what the end of the concert is. If there's any disagreement, then obviously the concert is doomed from the start. Secondly, one member of the concert cannot act in any precipitous way unless there's some kind of consensus for that action among the other members. Again, if one state is going to act independently, then the concert's going to collapse. Thirdly, states willingly, in order to make the concert successful, have to limit their prerogative to act independently. Remember, that's sort of the one quote-unquote benefit of living in an anarchical world, is that a state doesn't have to consult anyone when it wants to act independently, when it wants to make a decision or take any action. If you're in a concert relationship, you do then have to give up that right, or at least limit it, in order for the concert to be successful. You have to consult with your concert partners before you can take any precipitous action. And finally, the concert arrangement is not an excuse to gain advantage over another state. As we're going to see, cooperation oftentimes requires a state to open itself up to other states, and this means opening oneself up to diplomatic exchange, to trading information, to trading secrets sometimes, and this can make you vulnerable and make you nervous if you don't necessarily trust your partner. So there's a sense that if a state's going to enter a concert, there has to be a sense of good faith about it, that the concert is not there to allow states to take advantage of one another. It's not some cynical attempt to gain intelligence or to gain access to something that might not otherwise be available. The 19th century was the golden age of concert making and concert building, especially after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. The first step in this process was the formation of the Quadruple Alliance at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. This featured Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria mapping out and attempting to negotiate the future of post-war Europe amongst themselves. On top of that was the Holy Alliance, a concert formed by Eastern European states, primarily Russia, Prussia, and Austria, to sort of figure out what the situation was going to be in Eastern Europe, again after the defeat of Napoleon. Eventually, the Quadruple Alliance readmits a reformed France back into its midst, and that forms the Concert of Europe, which I'll talk about in a moment. And all these concerts throughout the next few decades will meet regularly to reassess the balance of power and to make whatever adjustments and tweaks are necessary in order to preserve the post-war order. So let's take a closer look at the Concert of Europe here. The Concert of Europe is interesting, not only because it's an attempt to preserve a balance of power after the defeat of Napoleonic France, but it's also an attempt to put a lid on what was seen as this revolutionary upsurge that was taking place in Europe at the time. France was the most obvious example of it, with Napoleon taking power and consolidating French society to essentially expand French power and conquer Europe. But there was also a sense that this was a problem throughout Europe itself, and that states had to cooperate with each other to prevent the possibility of revolutionary or republican upsurges in other states. So it's not just about interstate relations, it's also, in this case, about protecting aristocracy throughout Europe. The concerts that were put into place after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 held for a time, but eventually unraveled, resulting in the outbreak of World War I. Even after World War I, however, we see lots of opportunities for the great powers of Europe to form concerts and try to address certain new problems in the European balance of power, but failed to do so. One attempt at forming a new type of concert dealing with the aftermath of World War I was the Locarno Agreement. This was an attempt by Italy, United States, and Great Britain to ease some of the reparations burdens that Germany was experiencing as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. Unfortunately, France objected to easing this burden, and Germany continued to feel the weight economically of its obligations to pay reparations to France and other countries as a result of World War I. On the other side of Europe, you have the rise of Soviet power, and here the European powers failed to integrate or address or somehow account for this rising power out east. The Soviet Union was not allowed to join the League of Nations, as we'll talk about here in a moment. There was no diplomatic overtures made to the Soviet Union. A lot of this was for ideological reasons. And the result was that the Soviet Union was isolated and ignored, much to the consternation of other European powers when they do enter the scene in the run-up to World War II. Finally, and perhaps the greatest failure of European states not to use a concert to deal with an emerging threat is the rise of Hitler and the failure of European states to form a concert to balance the rising power of Nazi Germany. And of course, the Munich Agreement, where Great Britain basically agrees to allow Hitler to consolidate German power and annex territory outside of Germany, is the ultimate expression of this failure. After World War II, we also see some concerted efforts to build concerts and try to, again, restore and preserve balances of power. The UN Security Council is not a concert in and of itself, but it's definitely created in the spirit of concert building. What is the European Security Council, essentially? It is at least at the time, at the end of World War II, the five great powers of the world: Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, France, and China, and a handful of other powers who take turns sitting on the Security Council. And the idea here is that you create a permanent council that compels and forces states to consult with each other in the management of world affairs. Now, again, this isn't a concert technically because it's an institution that is constantly in session. So it's something more than a mere concert. But the UN Security Council is definitely a child and definitely an offspring of the original concert ideal. In other parts of the world during the Cold War, we see other attempts that bear a faint resemblance to concert building. When Richard Nixon made his diplomatic overtures to China in the 1970s, this was in essence an attempt to form a new, very small but new concert relationship with the United States and China in an effort to balance the power of the Soviet Union. Turns out that the Chinese and the Soviets, even though they shared a common Marxist ideology, didn't really get along all that well. And there was an opportunity for the United States to exploit that acrimony and turn the Chinese against the Soviet Union. We talked about arms limitation regimes, and again, this can also be seen as sort of the spirit of 19th century concert building, where the two superpowers on this particular issue attempt to cooperate and coordinate their actions in the limitation of nuclear weapons. Even in the contemporary world, we see some efforts and legacies of concert building. The Security Council resolutions to purge Iraqi forces out of Kuwait is definitely in the tradition of 19th century concert building, where the great powers see it as their common interest to rectify this violation of sovereignty on the part of Iraq and cooperate in order to restore that sovereignty to Kuwait in 1990. Right now with North Korea, you see an attempt at preserving a concert-like effort that goes back to the 1990s with the Group of Four, which at the time was the United States, South Korea, Russia, and China, and the Group of 4+1, which was those same states plus Japan, in an attempt to limit the ambitions of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. That seems to be collapsing right now as President Trump is changing U.S. foreign policy on this matter. And we see Kim Jong-un reacting as well to this shift in foreign policy. So whatever efforts at concert building that took place in the past may not be able to survive the current crisis. One area where you think there'd be a lot of cooperation in a concert form would be the problem of terrorism, because it's in the interest of pretty much every state to limit and stop terrorism in the world. And yet, cooperation and the formation of any kind of concert relationship to deal with terrorism has been very difficult to bring about. Part of this has been the efforts by the United States to deal with the problem of terrorism primarily through military means. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was in part justified as a way of dealing with the problem of terrorism in the Middle East. And of course, a lot of people objected to the invasion, and thus any attempt to cooperate on dealing with terrorism was hampered by the fact that many states viewed that invasion as illegal or unjustified or problematic in some way. We also see a real problem here with regards to Syria, and Syria as a place where terrorists have sought refuge, have been trained, have used as a base in some way. And here we, if anything, see the opposite of a concert. We see actually rivalry, especially between the United States and Russia, as both states attempt to articulate and implement competing visions of what a future Syria will look like. The United States wanting the overthrow of Assad and a pseudo or quasi-democratic Syria to emerge, while the Russians are perfectly happy with Assad and would like to see a state that is friendly to Russian national interests. These have taken priority over the problem of terrorism. terrorism is acknowledged a problem, especially terrorism in the form of ISIS, is a problem both sides in this debate have acknowledged, but there has been very little coordination and cooperation on this issue. The second form of security cooperation is the collective arrangement, or what the book refers to as Wilsonian collective security. Collective security is a form of deterrence, basically. It's institutionalizing or collectivizing a threat of retaliation for aggressive action. States enter into these arrangements to basically protect themselves from each other. This is an acknowledgement in many ways that states don't trust each other, and that the best way to alleviate that distrust is to cooperate in preventing any one state from gaining advantage over the other. And notice that you do gain a lot by entering into a collective security arrangement. You are lowering the cost of security and not placing the burden of protecting yourself solely on yourself. In theory, if a state acts aggressively against another state within the collective security arrangement, every other state will cooperate with each other to deal with that aggressive action. And so there's not as much focus and not as much need to developing overwhelming military force simply to protect yourself against all others. Some have described collective security as transforming the security of me to the security of we. The security of one requires the security of all. Collective security arrangements require basically three elements. The first is the rejection of aggressive war as a part of foreign policy. This is not the rejection of war itself. Notice that for states to punish aggressive states, they will have to have a military capability to dish out that punishment. But having a military doesn't justify you acting aggressively. And so there's a rejection of aggressive war as a part of legitimate foreign policy. Secondly, whenever one member of a collective security arrangement violates the treaty, every other state has an obligation to participate in the punishment and sanction of the violating state. You may not feel like this is necessary. In fact, oftentimes the aggressor state may be an ally of yours. But if you're part of that arrangement, part of that collective security arrangement, and one of your members acts aggressively, the treaty obligates you to participate in the sanction. And thirdly, we see international organizations, formal international organizations, taking a central place in facilitating cooperation. Notice we're not talking about concerts anymore, which are ad hoc, informal arrangements. We're now talking about formal brick and mortar institutions that act as adjudicator of conflicts. If there is a conflict, is a dispute between states within the arrangement, they will go to this organization to have the dispute settled. They will not resort to military action. When we look at collective security closely, we start to see some problems, especially as they pertain to the credibility problem in collective security. First off, we need to know precisely what constitutes an aggressive act. Now, upon first glance, this seems to be pretty simple and straightforward. Violations of sovereignty by one state through military invasion or some other type of military action would constitute an aggressive act. But what about things like trade embargoes, which are not aggressive acts per se? Sovereignty is not being violated, but the denial of an essential product or an essential resource to a state is definitely a threat to that state's national interest. Is that an aggressive act? And if it is, are the other states in the collective security arrangement obligated to go to war to punish the state that's engaging in that embargo? What about espionage? What about refugee crises, which can destabilize the domestic institutions when you have large flows of immigrants from one state to another? Is that can be interpreted as a threat, as an aggression, act of aggression, and can you use military force? Can you use the power of the institution to punish a state that allows these flows to happen in the first place? Secondly, when an aggressive act occurs, every state is obligated to participate in the sanction. There's no free riding that's theoretically allowed. But again, this becomes problematic, especially when you start talking about the fact that an aggressive state that invades another member of the collective security arrangement may in fact be your ally, and that you don't necessarily object to that aggressive act. If you're part of this collective security arrangement, within the legality of that arrangement, you are obligated to act. If you don't, then the entire security arrangement will collapse. And finally, there is a bit of a contradiction here when a collective security arrangement demands that armed military, or puts a taboo on armed military power, yet still demands that states maintain some kind of robust military power in order to deliver the sanction for the aggressive state. So on one hand, war is bad, we have to get rid of it, we need to stop it from happening. On the other hand, you better have a strong military to punish those aggressive actors. That can be seen as a bit of a contradiction. Collective security also requires a degree of stability for it to be successful. States have to be fairly well governed, they have to be healthy, they have to be well organized, they have to be able to field powerful militaries. If these attributes are lacking, then that reduces the ability of the security or the collective security arrangement to be successful. One of the biggest threats in this regard is domestic instability. Whenever you've got social tension, whenever you've got class conflict, whenever you've got something that threatens the stability of the state internally, it poses threats to the stability of the arrangement externally. Think about Napoleonic France. Why did Napoleon rise to power? Essentially, you had the French Revolution in 1789, you had class conflict within France, you had Napoleon rise as a way of consolidating this class conflict, and then use the prospect of conquest as a way of solidifying his consolidation. And so instability threatens the collective security arrangement. It opens up the possibility of aggression, or perhaps creates a temptation through a weakening state for another state to attack it. And so this can be very problematic. Collective security is only as healthy as its weakest member. Of course, collective security came into its own after World War I, and there are several reasons why this was the case. First off, notice that the outbreak of World War I was due in part to the failure of the balance of power to keep the peace. And we've talked about this, I think, in previous modules, where you have 6 great powers that ideally would have all worked independently to balance each other out, but instead they form 2 large blocks that sort of are locked into alliance structures that they may not necessarily want to be locked into. And then, of course, at that point, when one member of one alliance attacks one member of the other alliance, all 6 states have to participate in the conflict because they're all obligated to come to each other's defense. So seeing that, those who attempted to construct a post-World War I order said we need to avoid this balance of power arrangement because it doesn't work anymore. So we need to have something different. And the answer was collective security, where you're not going to balance power anymore. You're going to allow all states to enter into a collective arrangement that are all going to check each other within the institutional frameworks of the League of Nations to prevent aggression from taking place. Also, there was a sense that war had changed fundamentally. And again, we talked about this in previous modules as well. War became a truly devastating activity in the sense that entire populations, entire countries, entire cities were completely destroyed by the act of combat, whereas that was not the case in the past. And so war was no longer a sustainable activity. It had to be eliminated. Otherwise, it ran the risk of literally destroying human civilization in Europe. And so that results in a new norm, essentially, at least an attempt at a new norm against war itself. This is sort of epitomized by the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was a pledge that states could take where they would swear off war as a foreign policy. And the United States did sign this at one point. It didn't hold, obviously, but after World War I, there was a strong movement to essentially remove war from the toolkit of statecraft. Yeah, as we all know, the League of Nations failed. Collective security did not work after 1918. And the reasons for this we've already touched upon. One, despite banning war, states have to be ready to fight. There's a taboo placed on building up your military power, but you still need to have the military power in order to properly sanction and punish aggressors. States have to be prepared to fight allies if those allies are the ones acting aggressively. The treaties don't allow you to opt out of action if that's the case. And finally, we saw in the League of Nations especially that the balance of power impulse, the drive for powerful states to assert themselves and pursue their interests at the expense of smaller states was reconstructed within the institutional framework. That simply taking statecraft out of the salon, the parlor, the great power meeting, and putting it into the institution didn't eliminate the same rivalries that took place. It simply relocated them to a different forum. And so as a result, the balance of power wasn't something that could be purged and eliminated and avoided. It was going to recreate itself and reemerge. However, it was going to reemerge within the institutional framework. After the failure of the League of Nations and obviously the outbreak of World War II, there's a perception that collective security is this idea that's sort of been tossed into the dustbin of history, and that we realize the mistake of collective security and we don't do it anymore. And that's not true. Collective security didn't die after the League of Nations. After World War II, there was an attempt to revive it. And we'll see here in a moment what form that took. On top of that, there are other ways of trying to institutionalize security cooperation among states, and we'll take a look at some of those as well. So when we look at collective security today, there's one organization that leaps out at us as an obvious legacy of the collective security of the interwar period, and that's of course NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a regional collective security arrangement that originally was formed obviously to provide for security cooperation against the threat of the Soviet Union, but notice that there was a less spoken objective with regards to NATO, in that it was to prevent an aggressive act against other members of NATO. So it's not just about balancing the Soviet power, which obviously was very important. It was also preventing its members from attacking each other. And that if one member of NATO did attack another member of NATO, all the other members of NATO would coordinate and cooperate against that aggressive actor. Notice Article 5 of NATO, an attack on one is an attack on all, applies to the NATO members themselves as well. It's not just about the Soviet Union. Yet NATO has changed quite a bit since it was founded, and to simply call it a collective security organization is to ignore the complex institution that it has become. In fact, scholars now say NATO can better be described as a cooperative security community, which refers to, as according to the book, a model of interstate relations in which disputes are expected to occur, but they are expected to do so within the limits of agreed upon norms and established procedures. And this is essentially saying that war and violence and aggression are not acceptable ways of states within this organization to solve their problems. That there are other institutional and other protocols to follow that will deal with whatever security problems and security concerns exist within the organization. War has been essentially ruled out. And if you look at NATO closely, if you know people in the military who have spent time working at NATO headquarters or working under the auspices of NATO, the people who work in this organization, are committed to this idea. And there's the furthest thing from the minds of many of these states is the idea that they would use violence or aggression against another NATO member. They take seriously the cooperation that NATO requires. Where things get interesting when we talk about NATO is the notion of NATO expansion. And this is a huge topic that I could spend, an hour talking about. I'll only give you sort of a brief overview here of the main line of debate. Namely, what we're talking about here is the idea that NATO, since the end of the Cold War, has expanded from its original Western European base to incorporate many Eastern European countries. Some of these incorporations have been very controversial, none more so than the incorporation of the Baltic republics in the Northeast, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These were once states that were part of the Soviet Union, and once they became independent, pursued membership in NATO very quickly because they knew that NATO was very much committed to collective security. It was very much committed to defending its members against any threat from obviously the Soviet Union, now Russia. And so here you have three states that have always been at odds and having tension with Russia, very much wanting to get that guarantee, that security guarantee from the larger NATO states. Notice that in this slide here, we see a couple states that are coded as states that are seeking or aspiring to join NATO. One of those is Georgia, which you can see on the slide is quite a ways east from Western Europe. In 2008, the Russians actually invaded Georgia, in part because Russia believed Georgia was becoming too close to the West. Now you can imagine that if Georgia had successfully become part of NATO in 2008, and the Russians attacked it, invaded it, NATO would be obligated under Article 5 to come to the defense of Georgia against Russia. That means American troops would have to be deployed to Georgia to fight Russians. And that would quickly lead to images of American soldiers fighting and unfortunately being killed in this far-off land that most Americans couldn't find on a map. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, Georgia was never allowed into NATO. It was simply given observer status, and it's unlikely that Georgia will ever formally become part of NATO for this very reason. No one sees Georgia as essential to the security of Greater Europe. More recently, we've seen an interesting spin on this problem with regards to Ukraine. We know that a few years ago there was social unrest, domestic unrest in Ukraine that resulted in the Russian president, Russian-backed president, the Russian-friendly president, fleeing the country, being replaced by a Western-friendly government. And as a result of that, you had Russian forces, oftentimes camouflaged as civilians or as irregular fighters, entering into and occupying the eastern half of Ukraine, ostensibly working alongside the ethnic Russians that were already in Ukraine as Ukrainian citizens. We also see Russia annexing the Crimean Peninsula, formally making it part of the Russian Federation. Now again, imagine Ukraine is part of NATO and these events take place. You would have an obligation under Article 5 for Europe to come to the aid of Ukraine, defend it against Russian aggression, push the Russians out of Ukraine, and restore Ukrainian sovereignty. Again, is the United States willing to sacrifice substantial resources and its military capability to defend Ukraine from a Russian aggression? Those are very difficult questions to answer, but these will continue to be questions going forward as the tensions in this region don't show any sign of subsisting soon.